version 2 from Anthropic. In those cases, the robustness of the solution is substantially lacking today. And let's say that you are able to get a robust solution for your use case, you still are fighting the GPU battle, right? Like, you still have to be allocated sufficient resources to deliver your end product to your customers. Finally, you have the private LLMs option. And with regard to the private LLMs option, the real problem in my mind is that you have a lot of undifferentiated work that you're going to have to do, right? Like, somebody has to spec out the hardware, you have to go out and you find a data center, you have to make sure that the network pipe is there for you to communicate at the bandwidth that you need. Now, of course, I'm speaking here for building web applications, right? Like, if you're building a different type of application, some of these consideration sets are totally irrelevant to you. I mean, if you're building an embedded product with an LLM that's on board, I mean, none of this stuff is particularly relevant to you. But for most people building web applications, the build out of a data center and ensuring that you have the appropriate capacity and support, it really doesn't make a lot of sense in 2023 considering some of the other options that are available to you. So one of the things that I've heard a lot is like, oh, it's just a wrapper for ChatGPT, right? Like, a lot of people that talk about the various applications that people are building today, it's like, oh, that's just another chatbot, or that's just a wrapper around ChatGPT. And I saw this tweet, the one on the far left here, it's hard to see, but this is a bunch of Figma designs here. And it's like maybe 25 or 30 pages and like hundreds of components in Figma. And that's why I was like, all right, Pepe Sylvia from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, right? It's what it looks like up close if you see it. And people that have never had to build an app around an LLM before may substantially underestimate the level of difficulty associated with building something, you know, interesting to your users and reliable. It is kind of challenging from the limited experience that I have. And the other thing that I saw that I thought was just dead on about this, and people talk about, oh, what's your moat, right? Because that's what everybody who's building these types of applications is so concerned about. What is your moat? And then I saw this and I was just like, yes, this is absolutely correct. So let me go ask the hot dog stand guy outside the Giants game what his moat is. The truth of it is that, and I also am interested in the observability area of software development. And one of my favorite people in that space, she goes by Mipsy Tipsy. She's the CEO or the CTO of Honeycomb, if you're familiar with that technology. But she has this saying that the nines don't matter if your customers aren't happy. Like, I would suggest that there's some sort of corollary related to, you know, what is your moat? Customer satisfaction is the real moat, right? Like, if your customers are delighted with what you built and they enjoy using it, they're going to keep coming back for more. And I think that that's why a lot of people continue to use ChatGPT, right? It's just a chatbot. There have been other chatbots before it. It's not that special. But because the experience that people have when they use it is special, people continue to use it. So, about the challenges and some of the solutions that we've found to these challenges, because I mentioned we're trying to build an application like this today. And with regard to this, yeah?
Basically, before you go into that, on those all the different models, or did you pick one?
Oh, so today, we use a combination. We use the APIs from OpenAI. They offer GPT 3.5 Turbo at the 4K token limit. We use that to start. Then we go to the 16K limit if we overflow the context window. And if the user isn't satisfied with a particular result, ChatGPT has regenerate response is like what it asks if you don't like the result. But when we regenerate a response, we say do better. And do better is literally we'll go out and we'll hit the GPT-4 endpoint. And that automatically on our back end kicks off a process of, okay, why is this result not satisfactory? Because we do a lot of things related to dynamic prompting and dynamic meta prompting, which I'll show a little bit here later. But the idea is contextualizing what your user is asking for. I don't want to get too far into it because I'm going to cover it more in depth at the end, but there is this notion that most users don't come knowing what they want to ask, or at least how to ask what they want to ask. And so solving that is like a whole other problem. But I play with the open source models regularly. I'm watching that space very closely. For certain use cases, we intend on injecting that in as soon as we have the capacity. I have procured some of those GPUs in AWS in particular, which is where our solution is built. And that's where we do most of our testing against those. But for now, we're kind of holding off on that because the robustness of GPT 3.5 and 4 is just far superior to most of those models.
So how did you convince yourself to send your data to an external API? Because I think that is where almost every enterprise or every big company is afraid of. Like, I don't want ChatGPT because I have my data, it's going outside. So what are all the options? So,
yeah.
So how did you convince that, okay, it's fine, it's okay to come back?
So we have two different deployment models. We have the general consumer deployment model where we're just YOLO, you use the public APIs like everybody else. But we also do enterprise deployment. And in the enterprise deployment model, we actually offer the ability to use the private OpenAI instances in Azure, which have additional guarantees about how your data will or won't be used. And we found in most cases that, it's good enough for Microsoft themselves, right? So if it's good enough for Microsoft themselves, it's HIPAA certified, it's FedRAMP certified, I'm pretty sure as well. Those sort of assurances tend to go farther in helping people get over that. Candidly, the answer is, what is your other option today, right? Like, you don't really get too much of a choice with regard to that. Now, I do think that there are additional assurances that make people feel warmer and more fuzzy when you use the private instances in Azure, and we got early access to those for that reason. But at the end of the day, you're kind of bound to what solutions are available today, right? I would love if we could run, an open source model, because it's much more compelling if we're the only people who are touching the data. But ultimately, it's kind of bound in the situation by the constraints. So the challenges that we're facing. So hallucinations and knowledge gaps, right? This is one of the key areas, and I highlight this area because it's already had real world consequences. Here are two separate news articles, one about a radio host in Georgia who ChatGPT told someone that he was embezzling, and it became an actual court case because of defamation. So there's one implication of it. And another instance that I think everybody's probably a little more familiar with, if you've heard in the news, is that lawyers were trying to use it to quote cases in court, and mysteriously the cases don't exist, which is kind of part of why these tools are challenging to work with, but also the creativeness associated with that is kind of part of the benefit of the tools as well. Someone I was talking to actually said that the hallucinations are actually the part that they find most interesting and potentially most valuable out of ChatGPT. So that's something to consider as well. But why do these hallucinations happen? So fundamentally, the process is non-deterministic, right? There's pattern matching going on. I don't know if you played with the temperature variable in relation to the APIs, but even the open source models commonly have these as well. I'm gonna pause for a second. We have parking validation. If you park downstairs, please ask Emily. She can take care of you with at least a partial validation. So I know it gets really expensive. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, of course. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. So with regard to these though, so the process is non-deterministic. Fundamentally, you aren't going to get the same exact response from time to time of using the API. Even the same request entered twice in a row will get you slightly different responses. And the notion behind this whole next token completion, there's a really good article by a guy named Benedict Evans, who I think he's a venture capitalist, but he's very close to the technology in this space. And one of the things that he points out is that to talk about it as hallucinating or lying is probably not a good way to look at what's actually happening, because this whole notion of next token completion is a pattern matching scheme. And so it's not that they're trying, and here's this quote, he says, I think the best way to understand this is that when you type something into a prompt, you're not actually asking it to answer a question at all. What you're actually asking is, what sort of answers would people be likely to produce to questions that look like this? If you like that quote, I highly encourage you to go out and read his full article. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a thought on these hallucinations and one way to potentially address it that might be useful for anyone else building an app, but I don't know how well this would work, but if you kind of had, like, under your query, you have like an autocomplete with a peer-reviewed response, if you will. So if a response has worked for someone in the past and they accepted it and said it was correct, could you then use that response and feed it to someone else, and then they can also review it too and give it a thumbs up?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a strong intuition about where things are headed with some of this, and you have to bagel.
Or citations of actual source.
Just connect to
Right, yeah.
As well.
Your Facebook account, just use Facebook.
So then there are a couple of additional issues that you also have in relation to these. So you have poison data, which Chris was reviewing my slides, and he said, hey, I didn't really know that this was, I was skeptical that this is a real world thing. But I come from the cybersecurity field, and I don't know if y'all know, but we like the hijinks for sure. And so you can actually see it's really actually prevalent now when you talk about web browsing. So when you expose web browsing to these models, say in ChatGPT or in the Bing chat or whatever, you tell it to go out and look at a particular website, but if you host that website and you put malicious data on that website that it's then reading to interpret as part of its result creation or response creation process, then you can very well manipulate it. And there are working examples of this on the internet that you can see write-ups about. So poison data is emerging as a potential real risk associated with these models, especially when they get access to the internet. The other thing is misleading data. So where does the data come from that the models are baked on? And the reality is that we're going to see here in a second, there's a pretty diverse source of all of this data, and the quality of that, I mean, you're talking about very, very large amounts of data, so the idea that a human is going to manually review all of that data before it's ingested into the model is not that likely. Yeah.
Sorry, another question. Did you find that with the cybersecurity topic, were there more hallucinations because it was a more complex set of text? Like, I'm sure there's all kinds of abbreviations. Was that a problem for you?
So I don't think that, is complicated because cybersecurity isn't one area, but like a bunch of different areas. There are certain areas where I have found real deficiencies, but a lot of it goes back to what's the source data that's in the model, right? And you'll find that in particular, there's been a big shift in people believing that models should potentially be trained on a lot more code. So the reasoning behind that is that that represents logic fundamentally, and so that it imparts a better ability to reason on the models theoretically, or the pattern matching has more of a logical structure to it, so to say. And so the models that I've worked with on the open source space that have been primarily or heavily trained on code tend to perform better in certain aspects for the type of work that I'm focused on. And I'll say that for sure in relation to cybersecurity, one of the fundamental abilities that it has that's fantastic is that ability to write code or to give you example code for solving a potential issue. So a lot of cybersecurity revolves around evaluating systems that are already implemented technology-wise and saying, oh, this configuration isn't right, it has this security risk associated with it, or so on and so forth. And in working with models, I've found them actually very robust and capable, if you know how to ask it, to be able to help you write assessment tools and evaluate the responses from those tools. So I think it's sort of ambiguous at this point. I actually think that in my working with it, and a sample size of one here, but I actually find more challenges with it when working for creative purposes. So to me, a lot of the outputs tend to be fairly stodgy or like stiff, so to speak. And so when you're trying to do something creative, like, it's not necessarily that great at that. I do think it's really exceptional at like planning and breaking down a task into subtasks in ways that will help jog the memory, so to speak, of the average user. So again, it's really the reasoning capabilities or the effectiveness of the model for a particular use case is, I think, really still an open question. It's really interesting to see all of these evaluation techniques that are starting to crop up for evaluating the quality of models, and almost all of them end up having severe limitations because, you know, we're going to go into this later, but ChatGPT, you could ask it anything, right? And so it's trained on a very wide set of knowledge. Then with the last one here in relation to hallucinations, why they happen is sometimes it's just the data doesn't exist in the model, right? And in those situations, depending on how the model is trained, it may say, oh, as a large language model, I don't have an answer to that question. But in many cases, it'll just start spitting out stuff, right? Like those bogus court cases. So you have to do some sort of vetting of the responses that the chat is giving you or the API is giving you in order to ensure that you're getting quality responses out of it.
Follow-up question on the ability to write code, in particular SQL. You mentioned a little bit earlier. Is there an open source model that is comparable to the GPT 4 or 3 at writing code? And how much is the prompt? How much is the prompt you use to make up for that difference?
So prompting can make a huge difference. I'll say that for sure. Like the quality of your prompting, even in my own experiences, I'll share. I write a lot of infrastructure as code with help from ChatGPT, and I find that if the better I specify, let's say I'm writing CloudFormation or Terraform, the more descriptive I am in what I'm asking for, and the less hidden assumptions there are in what I'm asking for, the more accurate the response. As far as like, is there an open source model? The short answer is no. If I were playing with it though, I would tell you that there's one called Nous, N-O-U-S, Hermes, 13 billion. And I don't think they have a 65 billion parameter version of that model. But Noose Hermes is showing significant potential as far as that goes. And it's certainly an active area that people are working on. So data quality matters tremendously. And there's textbooks are all you need is a great archive article that you can go read where this figure came from. But in this figure is showing that the stack is sort of a famous data set that a number of models are trained on. And you see that that's represented by this peach color. So the scores of that model as far as human evaluation goes are really low in comparison to these other two models. And the first example is the code textbook data set. So it almost doubles in some cases the quality of human evaluation relative to just a large web crawled piece of data. But then when you add example exercises where someone is not just entering in, textbook data, so to speak, but also the user exercises evaluating their knowledge against the textbooks, all of a sudden you get tremendously better results in the human evaluation. So clearly there's a correlation there with regard to the notion of data quality. You also see it here in this other tweet where someone says, oh, hey, there's a ton of garbage in these base data sets, which I don't know if you went on Hugging Face and looked at any of the data sets, or you've downloaded zip files of any of the large data sets that are out there. Like Common Crawl in particular is just like a massive data set that a lot of these open source models use as a starting point. And that data is from all over the internet, and it's very limited in its structure and its cleansing processes associated with it. So when you're building these models or you're fine-tuning these models, it can be really challenging if you don't have high-quality, well-labeled data to begin with. And this gentleman speculates that, hey, it could be architecture magic, like they've cracked the code at OpenAI on how to architect these models. But the reality is more likely that they've just worked really hard on, or not just, but mostly that they worked really hard on making sure that they have better, cleaner data to work from. And you'll see here, this is an example from another talk that I pulled, and I apologize, I don't have the paper down here. But in this example, it talks through like 3 different ways that people have curated their data sets. And in this case, in the top section here, you have that they really use specific rules to clean the data. Like, that if the data has this in it, we're going to throw it out. And then they said, okay, and for deduplication, we're going to say, if we find 3 sentences in a row that are the same between multiple documents, we're going to deduplicate those and remove all but one of them. And then the other 2 options did per line removal for exact matches, but note, one of those ended up removing 55% of the data that they were originally going to put into the model just in this exact deduplication. So then you have like curated data sets, and we have some information on GPT-3. Obviously came before 4, but they did content filtering on known high quality data, so a little bit more advanced technique, and they used fuzzy hashing to deduplicate the data. So they only ended up having to remove 10% of the data. And you see similarly with another example where the POW, which is a huge web scrape data set, it also uses this fuzzy hashing, and you end up with only 26% of the data removed because they're doing a much more exact, exact's not the right word because we have actual exact deduplication, but they're doing a much more efficient job of deduplicating the data. And then in this case, the refined web source, which this is a publicly available data set that you can use for training models, it uses a combination of exact and fuzzy matching. And they ended up removing 50% of the data, but theoretically you end up with a much more robust data set. So how can you avoid this problem of hallucination, or what are some of the techniques that you can use to address hallucination? So one of them is, this is common if you played with Llama Index or LangChain, two of the popular libraries for coding with the APIs. They use vector stores to quote unquote ground the model. So similar to your notion of citations or having a known good completion from the user, this will actually go out and do a search against a database of known good information, return results from that database that are most relevant to your generation or your request, and then it will inject those along with your prompt in order for the AI to respond to that. So this is sort of the purpose of vector databases, if you're not familiar with them, is this notion that you can do semantic search or similarity search against data that you know to be good. And just in our use case, we've scraped a large number of, let's say, blog posts, and we've also taken a bunch of conference talks from cybersecurity conferences and done audio transcription. And we take all of that data and put it in a vector database, and if someone asks a cybersecurity question that the model doesn't know, or even if it does know, it will actually inject into the prompt of the user. If it's asking what is malware, and we have 4 different talks or blog posts that speak in depth about what malware is, the information that's most relevant from those posts will be injected underneath your question, what is malware? And so the AI responds or pattern matches in light of that additional information. So the problem with this is the context window. So if you've worked with any of the APIs, eventually you overflow the context window and you get an API error from the API saying, hey, and this is too much information, we can't process it. And so that 4,000 tokens is roughly equivalent to they say roughly 800 tokens is a page, like a single page of text. And so when you get to 4,000 tokens, you're talking about 4 to 5 pages worth of text that's potentially in your request and response. And it sounds like that's a ton, right? I mean, you would think, oh, well, I asked a question, it's like 2 sentences long, and maybe they respond with a paragraph or something. But the reality is, as your conversation goes on further, if you want the AI to remember the conversation that you have, you're continuing to add to a conversation history, and you're sending the entire conversation history to the API with each request. And eventually, if you roll along far enough, that will end up overflowing the context window. But the real rub is when you use a vector database. So I have some documents that are like 96-page long PDFs. That's not going to work, right? Like, that's obviously we've got to break it down to 4 or 5 pages. I mean, that's kind of tough, but that's sort of how that people solve for it today.
Hi, sorry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is like quick.
Yeah, okay. All right, so that's actually time, everybody. But yeah, I guess we'll.
Oh, just an hour?
Yeah, we just have an hour. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But anyway, thank you all for coming.
Why don't we do? Wait. Why don't we do a part 2?
Yeah.
In August.
Yeah.
That's
And next time y'all can extend your.
Because you've got.
Yeah.
He's got.
I know.
Like, you got a lot of really good information.
Sorry,
especially on the latency side. I saw his slides.
Yeah.
So they're really good. But why don't we do that for August?
Yeah,
and I'll do
absolutely.
mine in SAP.
Yeah. Isn't the whole world going to change between now and then?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's gonna come out.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. It's your first time. And now we know to make it local.
Yeah, awesome.
No
Thank you.
problem at all.
When
Now we
does-
just like clear space and like, 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
What's
When
up?
does Capital Factory close?
We don't really have a closing time, so we have co-working 24/7, but staff leaves at 8:30.
Awesome.
Thanks, Al.
I didn't even know it was that. It was good talk. So.
Well, we sat around and talked and introduced ourselves for like 15
Yeah.
or 20 minutes,
Yeah,
so it just
that's
kind of
true.
caught me off guard. But
Is this a once a month sort of?
yeah, so
Yeah.
every second Thursday of the month, we're gonna have meetups, and if you want to speak at upcoming meetup, please by all means just reach out again to me or Chris, and we'll set you up to speak.
Cool. That'd be cool on the day to join.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're very, very excited. I just had a call, just before this meeting, like our first major commercial deal got unblocked.
Oh, that's awesome.
Scary, not have to deliver.
That's a good thing.
But,
That's
yeah.
what you're in it for, then.
That's what we're in for, actually.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, anybody, like, good, I really desperately like a senior engineer, platform and AI, ML, ops, and, you know, all that good stuff. If anybody wants to talk ML ops in the next month, here's my card.
Yeah, and I don't know if y'all are members of the MLOps community, so there's a Slack group as well as a podcast.
Yeah. And there's a jobs thing on there too.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
please by all means
Yeah.
join the community and reach out to us there.
I
found the meetup through.
see that in
Cap
the
Factory.
actual, MLOps site, MLOps community site. We don't have an MLOps Austin there, so I haven't seen that.
Just send me.
I will
an
double
email
check on
and,
that because
I
it
can-
should be up at this point, but it may very well be the case that that's true.
Yeah. Did you have a card?
Yeah, give me my card. I got that for some reason.
Thank you guys.
Chris.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris.
Chris Cudray, yeah.
It's a pleasure to meet
Down here
you.
doing them.
Great.
Very cool.
Thank you.
All right. So what's that? Do you know cyber right?
Yeah, it's what, Isaac? Yeah.
This early stage funders.
Wes Ladd.
Okay.
Yeah.
Best funders early stage cybersecurity.
Okay.
One of my friends is a
Oh, and you are?
So where do you work in Amazon? Where's the office?
I'm
Some
Whole
point.
Foods.
Not at the moment, but
So
You
even
are-
Whole Foods
yeah.
is
You
not
are-
split.
you
I
know,
just
you
learned
should-
yesterday.
Awesome.
But
Sounds great.
He's like one of the very
Most
best
of us,
VCs I know.
including pretty much all of Whole Foods proper corporate, because we're actually Amazon at Whole Foods, is downtown at 5th and Lamar. Right.
So
in that corporate complex.
Well, right near
They
Whole
take us
Foods.
Amazonians and move
Oh,
them to like a
okay.
secondary building near there.
right.
And don't stop their kitchens.
I think it should get good, like grub, you know?
It's been improved lately.
Yeah.
I mean, I can always go over to the other building and raid their kitchen for all their
sort of
tea.
acting
But,
engineer.
Yeah, I feel like Whole Foods would get good because Amazon.
But on Amazon proper
So, yeah, it's
is
like-
at the domain.
Straight from fire.
I think they're all the way up at OS 22. So I know domain has OS 13, OS 16, OS 19, OS 22. And some of the Whole Foods people are OS 22. So this
I
don't usually go there, though.
in the science experiment, so that like you can
I'm probably-
mouse
I
on the
could
track
get it.
while watching a movie.
But-
So I want to do
Your name?
Just to
I'm
stimulate
Karen.
Karen.
as the
Nice to meet
experiments
you.
are
Me
going,
too.
based on what the
I'm
mouse
at-
is.
That's
It's
wow.
like you can be trained.
Open the
You're
domain, yeah.
like,
Oh,
you're learning.
oh,
You're
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
domain.
Is it like
Not in the
Altera
domain.
Parkway?
It's
you're
across
gonna
the
be
street.
such a-
So when you got top
You're
off,
gonna be
you look
such a
over
magnet
those
for
buildings.
people.
You know the Trend Micro building? Yeah, I
You're like,
interned
there's
there.
a
Okay.
standard.
So I
And
used to go
it's
to
just
Freebirds
interesting
all the
'cause
time.
Yeah.
I did some work with
Crossing Burnett was a little
universities
bit
and
scary,
cybersecurity
One person
related
research
to their
Trend Micro. I don't know if
biological
she still
science
does. She's in their
research
cloud
areas.
team, but
And it was
I
just
think more
wild
like
to hear
sales.
the stories from them
Yeah,
about
that was
how
really
like
convenient.
intense some of the
You said your
that-
name
that
was
aspect of it
Karen.
goes.
Okay.
But
They haven't found us yet. They might, I don't know.
It's interesting.
The funniest thing I learned is I was over at Baylor College of Medicine in one of the labs, and like, It's their favorite movie.
AWS is
Mad Max.
growing on
You
me
love the new Mad Max.
as a
You love the Mad Max. I don't know,
technology.
for some reason.
Oh, you were joking with
you
the
have to
live
use
that actually
AWS.
was.
They're watching the
Never
Matrix. Like, I was in there, right? They got clips from the Matrix.
It seems a little bit clunky.
But
Like,
my
watching
son
information,
live.
you have
It's
to
crazy.
So,
never done that.
is
kind
your
of blind.
stuff when you're at Amazon and use like their background?
Apparently not that blind.
Yeah, you like they have their own
Interesting.
account management.
The tools that you're building are specifically for
and it's different between AWS. Like I'm not in AWS.
So our
I'm
tools
in
are like, I mean, that's
like
what
the
we're selling.
consumer side,
And, you know, like.
consumer retail digital
Like
stuff.
Barry says, Mark Anderson
So
talks
they even
about
have two different account
a rap
systems
genius,
there.
when they funded Rap Genius, which is like this
It's all
thing
it's all
that's on the
managed
web
for you.
for
It's
annotating
kinda
like
nice.
rap lyrics. But like, this was the
But
thing
I-
he always tried to invent
I've been
for a web browser, and he
using-
never figured it
I
out.
just wish
And they
there was
funded
an
it, and it
LLM
became
that
Genius,
was trained
and
on
so
all the
General
internal
Genius
code data
died
there.
or died or something.
Because
But
then,
anyway,
because I'm like,
yeah.
what's the
You know, we're
Amazon
trying to
way
be
of
very
doing
focused.
this?
Oh, right.
You know?
Yeah,
on
yeah.
neuroscience.
Yeah.
What our founders
Because-
did. Our founder, our team are really
You know,
good
you
at.
come from outside
We got-
Amazon, you start
we,
doing things
like,
the
it
outside
started
way,
to
and they're like,
sprout.
oh, no,
There's,
no,
like,
that's not how we
Andy
do things.
Anderson just
But where's
comes
the
in and
role?
talks about
Yeah.
biology.
Yeah.
It's
We're
a tribal
crazy.
knowledge.
Kind of like the
Nothing
style.
about
What's
it.
the
Well, you
Amazon
just-
style?
you just have to
Like,
search
you use
Right.
all the
open
code
source tools, build
and find
anything
examples
you
and
want.
stuff.
And,
Yeah.
you know, it's, I wish I had.
Are you,
some economics
what do you do at
research,
Schwab?
Decade
I'm an
ago.
IT auditor.
And did a whole study of
IT
C
what?
and
Auditor?
citations.
Review
What's
like
that?
security
Supreme
stuff.
Court precedents over like 200
Yeah.
years.
So I mean,
and figured out
someone who
who's the
doesn't work in
most
technology, I'd say like
influential
I do access
It
reviews.
was great. And like none of my data
systems,
is like,
But
it's
I
not
do a
usable
lot
at
more
all
than that,
anymore.
and then we're also on like the project
man, if I
side,
had
so any
data,
major
don't you-
capital
I could
expenditures
handle that
within
all,
technology
it'd still be
credit.
useful.
We get
It's
a
kind of
select
amazing.
project.
There's so much waste. This thing
Yeah,
kills me.
I don't work so much on the project side, I do a little bit, we had acquired
There's so much
years
waste.
ago.
Well, what?
We acquired
I mean, the worst thing, like,
trade
okay, so
a few years
Oh,
ago.
yeah.
We're not doing
So
that.
we're still working
aggressive, like,
through
Yeah.
This is my
some
favorite
of
stuff.
that, so
One
it's
third
really
of all of the
interesting, all the projects
peer-reviewed,
coming out of
like
it.
high-end journal
Yeah.
articles
Evaluating
published in the
tools
field
and
of
articles,
genetics.
and then
Third
what
of them
is
all have
the
fundamental
way
errors.
now?
Right.
Whose way wins?
Oh.
Depends.
Amazon's way always wins.
Well,
They
it's-
acquired Whole
You have
Foods.
certain
If
genes,
you keep their
like 27 different
technology, it's
genes,
kind of hard to like
and
fight those people.
Excel interprets them
If
as a
they
date.
leave, you know,
Oh, yeah.
So if you
what do you
paste it,
have?
it's in a
How do you
sheet, it
figure it out?
basically turns it into an integer.
Amazon
and then
did
never matches
that.
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
With Whole
It's
Foods,
so
and they're
bad.
still
It's so
kind
bad.
of
And so, like,
dealing
that's
with
what
some of the
we're
old services.
kind of trying to take
Yeah.
on is,
That's-
you know, at least that is our focus.
I heard there were only
You'll
4 of
probably
the
get some-
original Whole
we'll
Foods
probably get some
people
uptake
left
in all
in
kinds
the
of
software
data
engineering
analysis
org.
pipeline stuff, 'cause
When
there
so
aren't-
Amazon acquired
there aren't
Whole
great
Foods,
tools
everyone
out there.
re-interviewed their
You
jobs.
just get like a
At least all the
Oh,
software
wow.
engineers
Interesting.
crazy
and
expensive.
4 survived.
Oh, wow.
Well,
I
there's
was
one
curious to
person
hear
we
what
acquired
the
through
other
that
resources
acquisition,
or
and
that
I was
you
like
can
looking
hear
at her
from
job history,
researchers
she had
that
this
you're
really
not
long
necessarily
tenure, and it's
solving.
like, oh my gosh, she's like
Well,
listed
yeah,
3
the,
acquisitions, like she's gotta be really good at her job.
the
Or like a
in science
chameleon.
research.
Right?
Or a chameleon.
Yeah.
Who's
That's
that?
the best people
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so in what way? Like
Where do you-
and what
So
are you
I
doing?
was talking
Well,
about
you're doing like
I
the journal
worked
research and
at
all that. Yeah.
I'll start with the
consulting
group.
company.
Yeah.
I used to work. I used to work
Yeah,
here
and I
actually
think
at a startup
huge amount
for
in that
5
space. So
years.
one of the things we were actually thinking
then
about
we sort of
applying
a lot
for
of people
grant
left, and
to apply
I went
LLMs
to
like
a company
experiment
called
like the data
PH Data,
structures,
and they're in
like searching
Minnesota.
That's
through
the
this massive
consulting
amount of
That's
data.
the consulting
but
company.
then
And
that's
then-
just within like a
but
single
then I
experiment, right?
work for a
so
company
another area which is like completely
Georgia.
untapped and unknown is
Okay.
what if you have
Georgia?
data from multiple
Georgia,
different experiments?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay,
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
Tennessee,
No,
Georgia.
no.
That's
I mean,
probably
Yeah,
yeah,
so,
that's probably
so
probably
it's been
way
really
off.
good, but I
Well,
work
that's-
In
remotely.
this case, I was thinking
And
about
I just work at home.
doing a systematic
That's
review.
awesome.
So it's been
And
great.
research is actually this is the thing. So one of the things
I'm
we
about,
were
I live
thinking
about
about,
7 miles away.
and we're not pursuing right
And it
now,
would
but,
take like
if you
45
have the
minutes.
body
Yeah, we had an office.
you have
around
the
here.
journal articles,
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some things you
We
can
don't
do
want
with
any
that.
of
Should be
that.
very
Are they gonna
helpful.
get all
Get the
set
meat
up?
After our
Yeah.
first meeting.
of all of
We
that.
should,
Look at
we
like,
should sort of
you know,
schedule, we can have
Yeah,
like an
we're-
after hours
what can you
party.
learn
Yeah,
about
for sure.
how different, like,
and maybe
types of
some additional
experiments, the
time
types of
next
algorithms
month.
Yeah.
that they use.
That's probably.
I mean, there's some
Do
statistical analysis.
they let you
way
have your
better
own
than that
finance
is,
accounts?
You know, looking for the
At
patterns.
Because I was looking,
Oh,
I
I see,
like
like,
tried to
what
apply,
papers
they're
are
like,
published,
you can have a
okay,
revenue
who was
account.
using deep
Yeah,
lab
And I'm
there's
like,
some limits to
and
it. I don't think
using,
Ron
you
knows
know,
the problem anymore.
electrophysiology in combination with
So
that.
maybe make some recommendations as to what the design of your study should be.
Yeah, like that,
based
or
on-
like recommend, you know,
And then we got married.
shoot, you know, the thing,
I
if
had
you wanna make some
to
money in this
take
space,
care of
do something that will
like,
help you write a grant that is more likely to get granted.
Yeah.
Got
You know,
through like
yeah,
a
yeah,
third
yeah,
of the day.
applications,
I know,
analysis
man.
that uses.
But it's
that
really
gives
cool.
you a
It
first
provides
draft.
like
I mean, I gotta write like.
It's good talk, man.
Yeah.
I gotta write like a 100-page grant application if I wanna do this AI thing and get government funding for it.
We'll do a part two, right?
Yeah. But I think the more interesting. So we're gonna go probably.
Yeah.
We need to go.
The
Oh,
thing
maybe
is-
it's not that was amazing.
What? The banks.
You're awesome.
The banks. So what do the banks have access to? Access to their own massive code bases. That's true. All they gotta do is train.
Well, and banks, I think a lot of the more low level, you start working with like from context of so a lot of those
I'm pushing for TypeScript, but. You write CDKs as your controller project.
But yeah, it is something.